rethink how we finance our affairs. African Union itself is almost 70% financed from outside, financed even by NGOs such as GIZ and Roll Wallenberg Institute and European NGOs. And what they do is they simply tell you, if the agenda is climate, they tell you to go to climate. If the agenda is human rights, now the main agenda is LGBTQI. They tell you, if you don't behave, we are going to cut aid.
Why would a country struggling with poverty expel the very organizations meant to help it? Why is Niger rejecting foreign aid at a time when it needs it the most? For years, Africa has been treated as a charity case. But what if aid was never really about helping? What if it was a tool of manipulation and control? Niger has just thrown out the Red Cross, joining a growing movement of African nations saying, "No more." But is this the dawn of a truly independent Africa? Or is Niger isolating itself to the brink of collapse? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. Something seismic is happening in Niger. For decades, this West African nation has been seen as one of the many former colonies that remain tied to Western influence, heavily dependent on foreign aid and military support. But the new leadership is making it clear that Niger is done with that image. The latest and boldest move? The expulsion of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, one of the largest and most influential humanitarian organizations in the world. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, was founded in 1863 in Switzerland, with a simple yet powerful mission: to provide humanitarian assistance and protect victims of war, violence, and disasters, without taking sides. It was built on the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, ensuring that aid reaches those who need it most, regardless of political conflicts or national interests. The Red Cross became one of the most recognized humanitarian organizations in the world, often working in war zones, refugee crises, and disaster-stricken areas. Its most important role has been ensuring the protection of civilians, prisoners of war, and displaced people, especially in conflict zones where governments are unable or unwilling to provide support. At first glance, this decision is shocking. The Red Cross has long been considered neutral, an organization that provides aid in war zones and areas of crisis. But Niger's government doesn't see it that way. The expulsion follows a pattern of rejecting Western presence, which started with kicking out French troops, expelling European-backed NGOs, and blocking foreign media. Each of these steps shows that the government is shifting away from the Western model of governance and aid, choosing instead to forge its path. But is making the Red Cross leave the country even justified? We will get to that later. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Niger is not acting alone. Across West Africa, countries like Burkina Faso and Mali are making similar moves, cutting off Western-backed institutions and seeking new alliances. This isn't just a Nigerian issue. It's part of a larger African awakening. The question is this truly about independence, or is the government setting itself up for failure by isolating the country from crucial humanitarian aid? To understand the significance of this moment, we need to dig deeper into why Niger expelled the Red Cross, what the consequences could be, and whether this move is part of a wider African resistance against Western influence. Niger's decision to expel the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, fits into a broader pattern that has unfolded in recent months. The government has been systematically removing foreign organizations that it believes are interfering in the country's sovereignty. This isn't just about one humanitarian group. It's about a growing suspicion that some international aid organizations are not what they claim to be. To understand why Niger has turned against the Red Cross, it's important to examine how the organization operates, how it interacts with governments, and why many African nations, including Burkina Faso and Mali, have begun to question the true role of Western-backed humanitarian groups. The Red Cross was meant to be neutral, yet despite this supposed neutrality, the ICRC operates within a global system that is deeply political. While it may not officially take sides, its actions can often have political consequences, influence public perception, and affect the balance of power in conflict regions. This is especially true when it operates in countries where Western governments already have strong economic and military interests. For Niger's leadership, this raises major concerns. If the Red Cross is truly neutral, why does it often focus its efforts in regions where Western political interests are at stake? Why are its activities more prominent in countries that have rejected Western influence rather than in nations where human rights abuses go unchallenged? This skepticism isn't new. Across Africa, governments have accused Western-backed humanitarian organizations of playing double roles, offering aid with one hand while collecting intelligence or influencing politics with the other. Even though the Red Cross insists that it is separate from any government, many African leaders remain unconvinced. For years, humanitarian groups have been linked to covert intelligence operations, and Niger's government is well aware of this history. Some aid organizations have been caught providing information to foreign embassies, mapping out conflict zones, tracking rebel groups, and even monitoring political movements under the guise of humanitarian efforts. These activities blur the line between neutral aid work and strategic geopolitical influence. The case of Acted, a French NGO that was expelled from Niger in November 2024, is a clear example of how humanitarian groups can be seen as threats to national sovereignty. The government accused Acted of working closely with foreign intelligence agencies and secretly funding opposition groups to destabilize the junta. This raised alarms that foreign organizations were not just offering humanitarian aid, but actively shaping the country's political landscape. A similar trend has played out in Burkina Faso and Mali, where leaders have accused NGOs of spreading misinformation, manipulating political narratives, and undermining national stability. Some organizations are working in areas controlled by insurgent groups, leading to speculation that they may be providing indirect support to rebel factions under the pretense of delivering aid. For Niger, these incidents only strengthened the belief that the Red Cross could not be fully trusted. Even though the ICRC has a long history of humanitarian work, Niger's leaders see it as part of a larger system that allows Western powers to exert influence over African nations in ways that are not always obvious. The government's concerns go beyond just direct political interference. Another key issue is who decides where aid goes and how it is distributed. Even if the Red Cross is not actively working against Niger's leadership, the fact that it operates as a Western-led organization means that decisions about aid distribution are often made outside of Niger's control. Who gets food supplies? Who receives medical care? Which regions are prioritized? These decisions, though framed as humanitarian, can have political consequences. If one region receives more aid than another, it can shift public sentiment, fuel divisions, and even weaken the government's authority. By controlling aid distribution, foreign organizations can silently shape the political landscape without ever being accused of direct interference. This is why Niger's leadership does not view the Red Cross as merely an organization providing food, medicine, and emergency relief. They see it as part of a larger Western framework that dictates the terms of Africa's crises. Aid, in their eyes, is not just about helping people. It is about controlling narratives, influencing governments, and ensuring that Western interests remain dominant. The decision to expel the Red Cross, therefore, is not just about removing one NGO. It is a statement against the entire system of foreign-led humanitarian intervention. Niger is asserting that it will no longer allow outsiders to dictate who receives aid, who is labeled as a victim, and how crises are managed within its borders. By expelling the Red Cross, Niger is making a clear statement. It no longer trusts Western-backed humanitarian efforts. But this move is not without consequences. Millions of Nigerians rely on international aid for food, medical support, and emergency relief. Without the Red Cross, who will step in to provide these services? Can the government fill the gap, or will ordinary people suffer as a result? This also raises the question of what the government's real objective is. If the junta is truly pushing for sovereignty, then this move is part of a broader plan to build a self-reliant Niger that doesn't depend on foreign organizations. The military coup in July 2023 set the stage for a radical transformation in Niger's governance. Since taking power, the junta has been aggressively pushing an anti-Western, pro-sovereignty agenda, severing ties with European nations, removing foreign military forces, and now cutting off humanitarian groups. The leadership's message is simple. Niger will no longer be a pawn for Western interests. The argument for sovereignty is compelling. For decades, Niger has been controlled by foreign powers, militarily, economically, and even in terms of humanitarian aid. Western countries have maintained a tight grip on Niger's economy, military, and political system, controlling who governs, how resources are managed, and even which policies are implemented. The military government now seeks to undo these decades of foreign influence. This shift isn't happening in isolation. Burkina Faso and Mali have taken the same steps, rejecting Western alliances and seeking new partnerships with nations like Russia, China, and other BRICS members. A new geopolitical order is emerging in West Africa, one where former colonies are no longer willing to play by the old rules set by their European overlords. But can Niger survive without the Red Cross? The West calls Niger one of the poorest nations in the world, and millions of its citizens depend on international aid for survival. Cutting off foreign organizations means the government must step in and take responsibility for food distribution, healthcare, and disaster relief. The question is, does Niger have the economic strength to do this on its own? The country's wealth is tied to its natural resources, particularly uranium. For years, Niger has supplied France with uranium while remaining one of the most underdeveloped nations in the world. If Niger takes control of its uranium industry and stops selling it at exploitative prices to Western nations, it could generate billions in revenue. Money that could be used to build infrastructure, improve agriculture, and develop social programs that reduce reliance on foreign aid. Another solution is investing in self-sufficient food production. Instead of relying on food imports and emergency relief programs, Niger could focus on developing its agriculture sector. With proper investment in irrigation, technology, and local farming initiatives, the country could move toward feeding itself instead of waiting for handouts. The final piece of the puzzle is forming new alliances. Niger, like Burkina Faso and Mali, is already looking toward non-Western countries like China, Russia, and other BRICS members for support. These nations offer economic partnerships without the colonial-style conditions imposed by Western governments. Instead of aid, they focus on trade, infrastructure development, and investment in key industries. Niger's path will not be easy. The transition from dependence to independence is always difficult. But if it succeeds, it could change the entire trajectory of African geopolitics. In the end, here is something that should make everyone think. Every time an African nation removes a Western organization, expels foreign troops, or takes control of its resources, the West reacts with outrage, condemnation, and even threats. But why? Why does the West care so much about Africa's security and development all of a sudden? Is it out of genuine concern, or is there something deeper and more self-serving at play? For decades, Western governments, NGOs, and corporations have built a system where Africa is kept dependent on them. Aid organizations flood the continent, promising help. Western military bases remain in key locations, claiming to protect African nations from insurgency. European and American corporations dominate Africa's industries, extracting resources at prices that keep African nations poor, while making Western economies stronger. So when countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali start rejecting Western aid organizations, kicking out foreign troops, and cutting off European economic ties, the West goes into full panic mode. Leaders in Washington, London, and Paris suddenly start talking about African instability, claiming that these governments are making a mistake, risking their people's future, and isolating themselves from the global community. But let's ask the obvious question. If Western organizations and military forces were truly helping Africa, why are so many African nations desperate to get rid of them? The truth is, the West's involvement in Africa has never been about charity. It has always been about control. Humanitarian aid, economic partnerships, and military cooperation are just tools to ensure that Western nations remain in charge of Africa's resources, its leadership, and its policies. Take Niger, for example. When the military government expelled French troops, cut ties with European NGOs, and started pushing for stronger ties with Russia and China, the reaction from the West was immediate and aggressive. France didn't just accept Niger's decision, it threatened to intervene, froze Niger's assets, and demanded that its military presence be reinstated. The European Union followed up with economic sanctions, while Western media began portraying Niger's leadership as reckless and dangerous. But if France's military presence in Niger was truly about fighting insurgency and ensuring stability, why didn't France respect Niger's decision to handle its security? Why did European governments block trade and freeze assets, knowing full well that it would harm Niger's economy? Because the West never actually cared about Niger's safety. It only cared about maintaining control. And it's not just Niger. Whenever an African nation pushes back against Western influence, the response is the same. When Burkina Faso expelled Western military forces, the West warned that insurgency would spread, as if Africa's problems could only be solved by foreign troops. When Mali banned French-backed NGOs, European leaders called it a humanitarian disaster, as if Africans can't provide aid for their people. When Zimbabwe nationalized its resources, the West imposed crippling sanctions, ensuring that Zimbabwe's economy would struggle, then blamed Zimbabwe's leaders for the hardship that followed. This pattern repeats itself over and over. Western governments do not care about Africa's security, stability, or betterment. What they care about is losing control. They fear that if Africa finally breaks free from their grip, it will lose access to trillions of dollars worth of resources, cheap labor, and economic partnerships that benefit the West more than Africa. The outrage over Niger's expulsion from the Red Cross is not because the West truly believes this will harm the people of Niger. If that were the case, the West would have invested in African-led solutions decades ago. Instead, Western leaders panic because every time Africa removes a Western organization, it is one step closer to full independence, and an independent Africa is a threat to Western power. Every time an African nation rejects Western influence, Western media is quick to declare it a mistake. The headlines are dramatic. Niger risks humanitarian disaster. Niger's junta is isolating the country, and expelling the Red Cross will harm ordinary citizens. But here's the question: a mistake for whom? When Western analysts, politicians, and media outlets say Niger is making a mistake by expelling the Red Cross, do they mean that Niger's people will suffer? Or do they mean that the West is losing control? Because let's be honest, the only time Western governments and media care about Africa is when Africa stops doing what they want. If humanitarian aid was truly about helping people, then why does the West react with anger and economic punishment when an African country decides to remove a Western NGO? If the Red Cross is truly neutral, then why does its removal send shockwaves through Western governments? The answer is simple. It's not just about aid, it's about influence. The West does not fear that Niger will collapse without the Red Cross. It fears that Niger will find an alternative solution that does not involve Western control. If Niger successfully replaces Western NGOs with African-led humanitarian efforts, alternative global partnerships, or direct government intervention, it proves that Africa never needed the West in the first place. And that is the real danger. Not for Niger, but for the Western system that profits from African dependence. Look at the language used by Western media when Africa takes back control. When France was expelled from Niger, media outlets did not focus on Niger's right to self-determination. Instead, they ran stories about how this would lead to greater instability and empower insurgent groups. When Mali removed Western-backed NGOs, the media did not ask whether those NGOs were genuinely helping. Instead, they framed it as an attack on humanitarianism itself. The same narrative is now being applied to the Red Cross. They say Niger is hurting itself, when in reality, Niger is hurting the Western system that relies on controlling African crises. The real mistake in their eyes is not humanitarian failure. It's the loss of Western influence in a country that was supposed to remain under their thumb. And this is why every time Africa removes a Western organization, the West does not offer alternative ways to help. They do not say, "We respect Niger's decision, and we will support locally led initiatives." Instead, they punish, sanction, and spread fear narratives, because they are not interested in an Africa that solves its problems. They need an Africa that remains dependent on them. So when Western media says Niger is making a mistake, what they mean is that the West is losing power, losing control, and losing access to another African nation that is waking up. The real question is Niger's mistake the beginning of Africa's success? Do you think Niger made the right choice? Should more nations give up on Western organizations? Let us know in the comment section. Do you think Africa still needs Western organizations? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.